The train's whistle pierced the Tennessee morning as Thomas Hartwell stepped onto the wooden platform at Millbrook Station, his worn leather satchel heavy in one hand and a crumpled telegram in the other. The paper had been read so many times the creases threatened to tear through the words that had saved him from destitution. Foreman position available. Good wages. Come immediately. J. Blackwood, Blackwood Cotton Mill. Steam hissed from the locomotive as other passengers hurried past him toward waiting carriages and familiar faces. Thomas stood alone, scanning the crowd for someone who might be expecting him. The morning sun cast long shadows across the platform, and already the Tennessee heat pressed against his wool coat like a heavy hand. "Excuse me," Thomas approached a middle-aged man loading crates onto a wagon. "Could you direct me to the Blackwood Cotton Mill?" The man's hand stilled on the crate handles. His weathered face turned toward Thomas, and something shifted in his expression, a tightening around the eyes, a pulling back as if Thomas had mentioned a contagious disease. "You heading there for work?" the man asked, his voice careful and measured. "Yes, I'm the new foreman. Thomas Hartwell." Thomas extended his hand, but the man didn't take it. "Lord help you," the man muttered, turning back to his wagon. "Ain't been a foreman lasted more than 6 months at that place in 20 years. Thomas felt the first cold finger of doubt touch his spine, but he pushed it away. He'd been without work for 3 months since the railroad project in Virginia had ended. His savings were gone, and winter was coming. Whatever superstitions these country people harbored, he couldn't afford to indulge them. "Could you tell me how to get there?" The man gestured toward the far end of the platform where a handful of carriages waited. "Samuel might take you part way. But I doubt he'll go all the way to the gates." Thomas approached the carriage drivers, all of whom sat with the lazy patience of men accustomed to waiting. He explained his destination to the first driver, a thin man with suspicious eyes. "Blackwood Mill." The driver shook his head immediately. "Can't take you there, mister. Road's too rough for my wagon." The second driver gave the same excuse. The third simply said, "No." By the time Thomas had been refused by all 5 drivers, a small crowd of townspeople had gathered at a respectful distance, watching him with the kind of morbid fascination usually reserved for accidents or public hangings. Their whispered conversations died when he approached. "Perhaps someone could give me directions to walk there?" Thomas asked the crowd. An elderly woman with silver hair pulled tight beneath a black bonnet stepped forward. Her eyes were kind but troubled. "Son, are you sure about this work? There's other mills in Tennessee. Cleaner work. Safer work." "I'm expected," Thomas said, showing her the telegram. "Mr. Blackwood is waiting for me." The woman read the telegram and her face paled. "Jeremiah Blackwood still hiring folks from out of state, I see. Still not telling them what they're walking into." "What am I walking into?" The crowd exchanged glances. The old woman folded her hands in front of her apron. "That mill sits on cursed ground, young man. Built right on top of the old Millbrook cemetery back in '47. They moved some of the bodies, but not all. Couldn't move them all." She paused, studying his face. "Things ain't right there. Haven't been right since the day they laid the first brick." Thomas felt his patience wearing thin. These people were trying to frighten him with ghost stories and superstition, but he'd worked in mills across 3 states. He knew the dangers: machinery accidents, cotton dust, long hours. He could handle those. "Thank you for the warning," he said politely. "But I still need directions." The woman sighed and pointed north toward a line of hills covered in autumn-brown trees. "Follow the main road out of town for about 2 miles. You'll see a smaller road branching off to the right, that's Mill Road. Follow it another mile and you'll reach the gates." She hesitated. "If you change your mind, son," there's work at the lumber mill here in town. Honest work." Thomas thanked her and set off walking, his satchel bouncing against his leg with each step. The morning was crisp, and despite the strange reception at the train station, he felt his spirits lifting slightly. Work was work, and any job was better than no job. The main road wound through rolling hills covered in oak and hickory trees just beginning to turn color. He passed a few small farms where children played in yards and women hung laundry on lines, but as he walked farther from town, the farms grew sparse and the forest pressed closer to the road. When he reached the turnoff to Mill Road, Thomas paused. The smaller road looked less maintained than the main thoroughfare, with deep ruts from wagon wheels and weeds growing between the tracks. A wooden sign, weathered and tilting, read, "Blackwood Mill, 1 mile." The road descended into a valley where the trees grew thicker and the air felt cooler. Thomas could hear water running somewhere nearby, probably the stream that powered the mill. As he walked, he began to notice things that struck him as odd. There were no birds singing in these trees, though he'd heard plenty on the main road. The silence felt heavy and watchful. After 20 minutes of walking, the trees opened up and Thomas got his first glimpse of Blackwood Cotton Mill. The building rose from the valley floor like a brick fortress, 3 stories tall with rows of windows reflecting the morning sun. Smoke curled from 2 tall chimneys, indicating the mill was already operating. But as Thomas drew closer, he began to see what had disturbed the people in town. The mill had been built directly on top of an old cemetery, and the construction crew had made only half-hearted attempts to clear the graves. Broken headstones jutted from the foundation at odd angles, their carved names and dates worn smooth by 20 years of weather. One corner of the building seemed to sag slightly, as if the ground beneath it wasn't entirely stable. The main gates stood open, and Thomas could see workers moving between the buildings in the mill yard. But something about their movements seemed wrong, too quick, too nervous, like animals that expected predators. "You the new foreman?" a voice called. Thomas turned to see a man approaching from a small building near the gates, probably a guardhouse or office. The man was perhaps 60, with graying hair and clothes stained with cotton dust. But it was his eyes that struck Thomas most. They held the look of someone who'd seen things he couldn't explain and had learned to live with the inexplicable. "Thomas Hartwell," Thomas said, extending his hand. The man shook it briefly. "Ezra Polk. I run the day shift when there ain't a foreman." His grip was firm but his palm was damp with sweat despite the cool morning. "Mr. Blackwood's expecting you in his office. That's the brick building just inside the gates." As they walked through the mill yard, Thomas noticed more disturbing details. The workers they passed kept their heads down and spoke in whispers. Several buildings showed recent repairs, walls that had been rebuilt, roofs that had been patched. And everywhere, protruding from the packed earth of the yard, were fragments of old grave markers. "Lot of accidents here?" Thomas asked, noting the careful way the workers stepped around certain areas of the ground. Ezra's pace quickened slightly. "More than most places," he said. "Ground's unstable in spots. Been subsidence problems since the mill was built." "Subsidence?" "Old graves settling. Sometimes the ground just opens up." Ezra stopped walking and turned to face Thomas, his expression serious. "Listen, Mr. Hartwell, I don't know what Mr. Blackwood told you in that telegram, but there's things about this place you need to understand. We only run during daylight hours. Never at night. And there's parts of the mill, the basement levels, some of the storage rooms, where you don't want to go alone." "Why not?" Ezra looked around nervously, as if checking to see who might be listening. "Because sometimes you hear things down there. Sounds like machinery running when all the power's been shut off. Sounds like people working when the building's supposed to be empty." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What kind of sounds?" "Looms running. Spinning wheels turning. Voices calling out work orders. Ezra's voice dropped to almost a whisper. And sometimes, if you listen real careful, you can hear something else underneath all that. Something that don't sound like machinery at all. Before Thomas could ask what he meant, a sharp whistle cut through the air, the signal for the work shift to begin. Workers across the mill yard began moving toward their assigned buildings with practiced efficiency, but Thomas noticed they all avoided walking over certain patches of ground where the broken headstones were thickest. "That's the work bell," Ezra said. "Mr. Blackwood will want to see you now. His office is on the second floor of the main building, you can't miss it." As Thomas walked toward the mill's main entrance, he found himself stepping carefully around the grave fragments embedded in the pathway. One broken headstone caught his eye, its inscription still partially legible, "Sacred to the memory of." The rest was worn away, but the dates he could make out were from the 1840s. He paused at the mill's front door, his hand on the brass handle. Through the windows, he could see workers moving between massive looms and spinning frames, their movements quick and purposeful. The building hummed with the sound of machinery, but underneath that familiar industrial rhythm, Thomas thought he detected something else, a deeper sound, like a distant heartbeat. Have you ever taken a job that everyone warned you against, where desperation made you ignore every red flag? Thomas pushed open the door and stepped inside Blackwood Cotton Mill, leaving the morning sun behind him. The heavy door swung shut with a sound like a coffin lid closing, and somewhere deep beneath his feet, in the foundations built on disturbed graves, something that had been waiting for 22 years began to stir. The mill's interior struck Thomas immediately with its oppressive atmosphere. The main floor stretched out before him like a cavern, filled with the thunder of looms and the whir of spinning frames. Workers moved between the machines with mechanical precision, but their faces held a tension he'd never seen in other mills, a constant wariness, as if they expected something to go wrong at any moment. Cotton dust hung in the air like fog, and the floorboards beneath Thomas's feet felt uneven, warped in places where the foundation had apparently settled over the years. Through gaps in the wooden planks, he caught glimpses of darkness below, basement levels that seemed to extend deeper than necessary for a cotton mill. "Mr. Hartwell, I presume?" Thomas turned to see a tall man descending a wooden staircase at the far end of the main floor. Jeremiah Blackwood was perhaps 50 years old, with iron-gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His clothes were expensive but practical, black wool suit with a gold watch chain draped across his vest. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, pale blue and unnaturally bright, as if lit from within. "Mr. Blackwood," Thomas said, extending his hand. "Thank you for the opportunity." Blackwood's handshake was firm but brief, and Thomas noticed the man's fingers were cold despite the warmth of the mill. "Come to my office. We have much to discuss." They climbed the stairs to the second floor, passing workers who kept their eyes downcast as Blackwood walked by. Thomas noticed several of the mill hands bore fresh bandages on their hands and arms, an unusual number of recent injuries for a well-run operation. Blackwood's office occupied a corner of the second floor, with windows overlooking both the mill floor and the cemetery grounds beyond. The room was spartanly furnished, a heavy oak desk, 2 chairs, and a bookshelf filled with ledgers and mill records. But what drew Thomas's attention was the large map mounted on one wall, showing the mill property in precise detail. Red X marks covered significant portions of the map, particularly in areas where the building's foundation intersected with the old cemetery. "Subsidence problems," Blackwood said, noticing Thomas's interest in the map. "The ground here is challenging. We've learned to work around it. The people in town seemed concerned about this location," Thomas said carefully. "They mentioned the mill was built on cemetery grounds." Blackwood moved to the window overlooking the mill floor. "Superstitious nonsense." "Yes, there was a small burial ground here before construction began. We relocated most of the remains to the new cemetery outside town. The few graves we couldn't move were sealed properly and incorporated into the foundation. Nothing unusual about that. Half the buildings in Tennessee sit on old burial grounds. Thomas joined him at the window. Below, the workers moved through their tasks with grim efficiency, but he noticed they all avoided certain areas of the floor, spaces that, according to the map, corresponded with the red X marks. "I notice you only run during daylight hours," Thomas said. "Most mills I've worked operate around the clock to maximize production." Blackwood's reflection in the window went very still. When he turned to face Thomas, his pale eyes had grown hard. "We've found day shifts more manageable. The workers prefer it, and productivity remains high. There's no need for night operations. But surely we could increase output significantly with a second shift. The demand for cotton goods." "Mr. Hartwell," Blackwood's voice carried a sharp edge. "I've been operating this mill for 22 years. The schedule we maintain serves our purposes. I trust you won't question established procedures." Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks. He'd been hired as foreman, which typically meant he'd have input on operational decisions. But he needed this job, so he swallowed his objections. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood. I simply wanted to understand the reasoning." Blackwood's expression softened slightly. "The reasoning is simple. This mill has unique characteristics that require special management. You'll learn them in time." He moved to his desk and pulled out a thick folder. "These are the operational reports for the past 6 months. Study them carefully. You'll notice we have a higher rate of workplace incidents than most mills." Thomas opened the folder and immediately saw what Blackwood meant. The accident reports filled dozens of pages: workers injured by machinery that had been properly maintained, falls through floorboards that should have supported their weight, injuries from falling objects in areas where nothing should have been overhead. The frequency was alarming. "Are there mechanical issues with the equipment?" Thomas asked. "The machinery is maintained to the highest standards," Blackwood replied. "The problems are environmental. Related to the foundation issues I mentioned. Ground settlement causes unexpected structural failures." Thomas continued reading, noting that most accidents occurred in specific areas of the mill, the same areas marked with red X's on the map. "Have you considered relocating operations away from the unstable sections? Those sections contain our most productive equipment. Moving operations would be costly." Blackwood walked to a cabinet and withdrew a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. "Besides, the workers have learned to be cautious. Accidents have decreased in recent months." As if summoned by their conversation, a commotion erupted on the mill floor below. Through the window, Thomas saw workers gathering around one of the large looms. Someone was shouting for help. Blackwood set down the whiskey bottle and moved to the window. His face showed no surprise, only resignation. "Another incident, it seems." They hurried downstairs to find workers clustered around a loom where a young man sat holding his left hand against his chest. Blood seeped between his fingers, and his face was white with pain and shock. "What happened?" Thomas asked. Ezra Polk appeared at his elbow. Jimmy was threading new warp through the loom when the shuttle mechanism triggered on its own. Caught his fingers between the beaters. Thomas examined the loom. The machinery was definitely shut down, no power, no motion. Yet according to the workers, it had somehow activated just long enough to injure the man. "Has this loom malfunctioned before?" Thomas asked. Several workers exchanged glances. Finally, an older woman spoke up, "That's the 3rd incident on this loom in 2 months, sir. Always the same thing, mechanism triggers when the power's off." "Impossible," Thomas said. "Mechanical looms can't operate without power." "Tell that to the loom," the woman replied quietly. Blackwood appeared with a medical kit and began tending to the injured worker's hand. "Jimmy, you know better than to work alone on the equipment in this section. Always work in pairs here." "I wasn't alone, Mr. Blackwood," Jimmy said through gritted teeth. "Sarah was right beside me when it happened. She was handing me the thread." Thomas looked around. "Where is Sarah now?" The workers fell silent, glancing at each other with worried expressions. Finally, Ezra spoke. "There ain't no Sarah working this shift, Mr. Hartwell." Jimmy was alone at the loom. Jimmy's eyes widened. "That's not true. She was right there, helping me thread the warp." Middle-aged woman with brown hair, wearing a blue work dress. Said she knew this loom better than anyone because she'd been working it for years. "Jimmy," Ezra said gently, "there ain't been a woman named Sarah working this mill since Sarah Coolidge died in an accident 15 years ago. And she did work that exact loom." The injured man's face went from white to gray. Thomas felt a chill settle in his stomach as he began to understand the kind of environmental problems Blackwood had been referring to. "Get Jimmy to the doctor in town," Blackwood ordered. "And shut down that loom for inspection." As the crowd dispersed, Thomas found himself alone with Blackwood beside the silent loom. The mill owner was studying the machine with the expression of someone facing a familiar but unwelcome problem. "How often do workers report seeing people who aren't there?" Thomas asked quietly. Blackwood was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible over the ambient noise of the mill. "More often than I'd like. Less often than they used to." He looked directly at Thomas. "That's why we don't operate at night, Mr. Hartwell. During daylight hours, these incidents are manageable. After dark, they become dangerous." "What exactly happens after dark?" Blackwood glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "The mill operates whether we want it to or not. Machinery runs without power. Looms work with no one operating them. And the workers you see." He paused. "Let's just say not all of them punch a time clock." Thomas felt his rational worldview tilting on its axis. "You're telling me this mill is haunted?" "I'm telling you this mill has a workforce that extends beyond normal employment practices," Blackwood replied carefully. "Some of our workers have been here much longer than others. Some have been here since the mill opened." That evening, Thomas walked back to the boarding house in town where he'd taken a room, his mind churning with the day's revelations. The logical part of him insisted there had to be rational explanations for everything he'd witnessed: mechanical failures, worker suggestibility, possibly gas leaks causing hallucinations. But the injured man's description of Sarah troubled him. Too detailed, too specific for a hallucination. And the way the other workers had reacted when he described her, not with the embarrassment of people humoring a confused colleague, but with the recognition of people who'd heard such descriptions before. After a simple dinner at the boarding house, Thomas returned to his room and tried to focus on the operational reports Blackwood had given him. But as he read, patterns emerged that made his skin crawl. Accidents clustered around specific dates, the anniversaries of previous accidents at the same locations. Workers reported seeing the same mysterious colleagues repeatedly: Sarah at the looms, a man named Marcus in the spinning room, an elderly black man called Solomon who appeared in the basement levels. And all of these phantom workers had one thing in common: according to the mill's employment records, they had all died in workplace accidents over the past 20 years. Thomas set the reports aside and walked to his window, looking out over the darkened town. In the distance, toward the mill, he thought he could see lights flickering in the windows of the supposedly shut-down building. As he watched, the lights moved from window to window in patterns that suggested people moving through the mill floor, carrying lanterns or candles. He checked his pocket watch: nearly midnight. The mill should be completely dark and empty. Thomas made a decision that would change everything. He dressed quickly, slipped out of the boarding house, and began walking toward Mill Road. He had to see for himself what happened at Blackwood Cotton Mill after dark. The night air was cool and still as he approached the mill gates. The guards who watched the entrance during the day were gone, but the gates stood open as if expecting him. As Thomas walked through the mill yard, he could hear it clearly now, the sound of machinery operating at full capacity, the rhythm of looms and spinning frames working in perfect synchronization. Light spilled from the mill windows, and through them Thomas could see figures moving between the machines, workers in clothes that looked decades out of date, their movements efficient and practiced. The mill was operating a full night shift with people he'd never seen before. Thomas approached the main entrance, his heart pounding. The door stood slightly ajar, and warm air flowed out carrying the familiar scents of cotton fiber and machine oil. But underneath those normal mill odors was something else, the musty smell of earth and decay, as if the building's foundations were exhaling the breath of old graves. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, entering a world that existed in the space between the living and the dead, where the mill's night shift had been working without interruption for 22 years. The mill's interior blazed with light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Every machine operated at peak capacity, tended by workers Thomas had never seen during the day shift. They moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had performed the same tasks thousands of times, their faces serene and focused. But as Thomas watched more carefully, he began to notice the wrongness. The workers cast no shadows despite the bright illumination. Their feet made no sound on the wooden floors. And when one of them passed directly in front of a window, Thomas could see the mill yard beyond through her translucent form. A woman operating a spinning frame looked up and met his eyes. She was perhaps 30 years old, with brown hair pinned back and wearing a blue work dress that seemed to shimmer like water. Thomas recognized her immediately from Jimmy's description. "You're Sarah," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She smiled and nodded. "Sarah Coolidge. I've been waiting to meet you, Mr. Hartwell." Her voice sounded distant, as if spoken from the bottom of a well. "We all have." Other workers began turning to look at him, and Thomas realized the entire night shift was becoming aware of his presence. They didn't seem hostile, merely curious about this living man who had wandered into their eternal workplace. "You're all dead," Thomas said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "Dead is such a limiting word," replied a voice behind him. Thomas turned to see a middle-aged man with calloused hands and cotton dust in his hair. "We prefer to think of ourselves as permanently employed." Despite his fear, Thomas found himself drawn into conversation. "How long have you been working here?" "I'm Marcus Hendley," the man said. "Died in 1854 when a drive belt snapped and caught my neck. Been on the night shift ever since." He gestured toward the other workers. "Most of us died in accidents, caught in machinery, fell through weak floorboards, crushed by falling equipment. But we don't hold grudges. The mill needs workers, and we need purpose." Sarah approached, her footsteps silent on the wooden floor. "The living workers won't stay after dark. They're afraid of us. But there's nothing to fear, we're just trying to do our jobs." "But why?" Thomas asked. "Why do you keep working after death?" The spectral workers exchanged glances. Finally, Marcus answered, "Because something down below won't let us rest. It feeds on work, on production, on the energy of purpose. As long as we keep the machinery running, it stays satisfied. If we stop..." He shuddered, his translucent form flickering like candlelight. "We've seen what happens when the mill falls silent for too long." Thomas felt a chill deeper than the night air. "What's down below?" Before anyone could answer, the mill's machinery began to slow. The looms reduced their rhythm, the spinning frames wound down, and the night shift workers looked around with expressions of concern. "Dawn's coming," Sarah said. "We have to go." "But Mr. Hartwell, you should know that your name is in the ledger." "What ledger?" "Mr. Blackwood's private records. He keeps track of everyone who's going to die here." Her form was already beginning to fade as the first pale light of dawn crept through the eastern windows. "You might want to find that ledger before your time comes." As the sun rose, the ghostly workers vanished one by one until Thomas stood alone in a completely dark and silent mill. The machinery that had been running moments before was cold and still. Even the sense of cotton and oil had faded, replaced by the musty odor of a building that had stood empty all night. Thomas made his way to the main entrance on trembling legs. Had he dreamed the entire encounter? But the memory was too vivid, too detailed for a dream. And Sarah's warning about the ledger echoed in his mind with terrible urgency. He walked back to town as the sun climbed higher, his mind reeling with questions. If the mill truly was haunted by its dead workers, why had Blackwood continued operating it? What was the entity the ghosts had mentioned, something that fed on work and kept them bound to their eternal shifts? And most importantly, what did Sarah mean about his name being in a ledger? Thomas spent the morning going through the motions of his foreman duties, but his thoughts kept returning to the previous night's encounter. He watched the living workers carefully, noting how they avoided certain areas of the mill and how they never worked alone in the sections marked with red X's on Blackwood's map. During the lunch break, Thomas made his decision. He had to find Blackwood's private ledger. Blackwood had left the mill on business in town, providing Thomas with an opportunity to search the man's office. He waited until the mill floor was mostly empty, then slipped upstairs. The office door was locked, but the mechanism was old and simple. Thomas had learned lockpicking during his lean years, and within minutes he was inside. The office looked the same as before, but now Thomas examined it with different eyes. He methodically searched the desk drawers, finding the usual business correspondence and operational reports. The bookshelf held ledgers going back to the mill's founding, but they contained only standard production and employment records. It was behind the large map that Thomas found a hidden panel. His fingers detected a slight depression in the wall, and when he pressed it, a section of the paneling swung inward to reveal a small safe. The safe was newer than the mill, installed probably within the past 10 years. Thomas studied the lock mechanism, but this was beyond his picking skills. However, as he examined the safe more closely, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Scratched into the metal around the lock were symbols that didn't look entirely human in origin. They resembled letters but twisted into shapes that hurt to look at directly. As Thomas studied them, he felt a strange compulsion to trace the symbols with his finger. The moment his skin touched the metal, the safe door swung open with a soft click. Inside, Thomas found what he was looking for, a leather-bound ledger with "Private Records" embossed on the cover in faded gold letters. But there was something else in the safe that made his hands shake as he lifted it out, a thick document written in the same twisted script as the symbols on the safe, signed at the bottom with names he recognized, Jeremiah Blackwood, and something else that looked like it had been written with a claw rather than a pen. Thomas opened the ledger first. The pages contained names, dates, and brief descriptions written in Blackwood's careful handwriting. Sarah Coolidge, October 15, 1854. Loom accident. Caught between beaters. Fulfilled obligation to Section 7, Plot 23. Marcus Hendley, December 3, 1854. Drive belt failure. Neck broken. Fulfilled obligation to Section 12, Plot 45. James Morrison, March 22, 1856. Fall through floorboards into basement level. Disappeared. Fulfilled obligation to Section 15, Plot 67. Page after page contains similar entries, each death carefully documented and linked to a specific section and plot number. Thomas realized these weren't just employment records, they were a catalogue of souls claimed by whatever entity lurked beneath the mill. As he neared the end of the ledger, Thomas found entries for more recent accidents, including Jimmy's injury from the previous day. But it was the final page that made his heart stop. Written in fresh ink, dated 3 days in the future, was his own name. Thomas Hartwell, October 18, 1869. Basement accident during inspection. Fall into foundation level. Will fulfill obligation to Section 1, Plot 1. Below his name, in parentheses, Blackwood had written, strong life force. Should sustain primary obligation for 8 to 10 years. Thomas's hands trembled as he set down the ledger and picked up the strange document. The twisted writing was difficult to read, but gradually he began to make out the words. It was a contract of some kind, written in what appeared to be a mixture of English and something much older. The document spoke of a covenant of perpetual labor between Jeremiah Blackwood and an entity identified only as the sleeper beneath the foundations. In exchange for prosperity and protection, the Blackwood family agreed to provide the entity with a steady supply of human life force, channeled through the deaths of mill workers whose bodies would be interred in specific locations within the building's foundation. The contract specified that workers who died within the mill grounds would be bound to continue their labor in spiritual form, their eternal work feeding the entity below. The more workers who died, the stronger the entity became, and the greater the prosperity it provided to the Blackwood family. But there was a provision that made Thomas's blood run cold. Every 10 years, the contract required a primary sacrifice, someone with a particularly strong life force whose death would sustain the entity for the next decade. The document listed previous primary sacrifices going back to 1847, and Thomas realized these were the mill's previous foremen, all of whom had died in mysterious accidents. Thomas was to be the next primary sacrifice, his death scheduled for 3 days hence. A sound from the mill floor below made Thomas freeze. Footsteps were approaching the staircase. Blackwood had returned early. Thomas quickly photographed the relevant pages of the ledger with his mind, memorizing the key details, then returned everything to the safe. The door closed with the same soft click, and Thomas slipped out of the office just as Blackwood's footsteps reached the second floor. "Ah, Thomas," Blackwood said, encountering him in the hallway. "How are you settling in?" Thomas forced his voice to remain steady. "Very well, Mr. Blackwood. I was just checking the upper-level machinery." Blackwood's pale eyes studied Thomas's face intently, as if searching for signs of deception. "I trust you're not finding the work too challenging." "Not at all," Thomas lied. "Though I am curious about the basement levels. I'd like to inspect the foundation situation you mentioned." Something flickered in Blackwood's expression, satisfaction mixed with anticipation. "Of course. In fact, I was going to suggest a thorough inspection of the basement tomorrow morning. There have been some developments that require immediate attention." Thomas nodded, knowing he was walking into a trap but unable to see any way to avoid it without revealing his discovery. "I'll be ready." That night, Thomas lay awake in his boarding house room, staring at the ceiling and trying to formulate a plan. He had 3 days to live unless he could find a way to break the supernatural contract that bound the mill. But how do you fight an entity that has been claiming souls for over 20 years? The answer came to him near dawn, as exhaustion finally began to claim him. The ghostly workers had mentioned that the entity needed constant feeding through their labor. If the mill could somehow be stopped, permanently stopped, perhaps the contract could be broken and the trapped souls freed. But first, he had to survive his scheduled appointment with death in the mill's basement. And for that, Thomas realized, he would need allies. He would need the help of the dead. Thomas spent the next day moving through his foreman duties in a haze of barely controlled terror. Every shadow seemed to hide menace, every mechanical sound carried the threat of impending doom. Workers noticed his distraction and gave him concerned looks, but he couldn't risk confiding in anyone. Not yet. As the afternoon wore on, Blackwood appeared increasingly pleased with himself, humming softly as he moved through the mill and checking his pocket watch with unusual frequency. Thomas realized the man was counting down to the moment of his planned murder with the anticipation of someone awaiting a long-promised reward. Near closing time, Blackwood approached Thomas at his supervisory station. "I trust you're prepared for tomorrow morning's basement inspection." "Of course," Thomas replied, his mouth dry. "What exactly are we looking for down there?" "Foundation problems," Blackwood said with a smile that never reached his pale eyes. "Structural issues that need immediate attention. I think you'll find the basement levels quite illuminating." That evening, Thomas skipped dinner and walked directly to the mill. He had to speak with the night shift before his scheduled death, and he had to hope they would be willing to help a living man break the supernatural chains that bound them all. The mill gates stood open as before, and warm light spilled from the windows as the ghostly workers took up their eternal tasks. Thomas entered without hesitation this time, and immediately sought out Sarah Coolidge at her spinning frame. "You came back," she said, looking up from her work with a sad smile. "I hoped you wouldn't." "I found the ledger," Thomas said without preamble. "And the contract. I know about the primary sacrifice tomorrow." Sarah's hand stilled on the spinning frame. Around the mill floor, other spectral workers began turning to listen. "Then you know there's no escape. Not for you, and not for us." "There has to be a way to break the contract," Thomas insisted. 22 years of people dying, 22 years of souls trapped in this place. It has to end. Marcus Hendley materialized beside them, his expression grim. "Many have tried, Mr. Hartwell. Previous foremen, workers who discovered the truth, even some of the townspeople. All failed. The entity below is ancient and powerful. It was here long before the cemetery, long before the Cherokee, long before any human set foot in this valley. But you're still here," Thomas argued. "Still conscious, still able to think and choose. That means the entity doesn't have complete control over you." "We work because we must," said a new voice. Thomas turned to see an elderly black man approaching, his clothes marking him as one of the mill's earliest workers. "I'm Solomon Washington. Been here since 1847, when they first broke ground for this cursed place." "You were there when the mill was built?" Solomon nodded, his ancient eyes holding decades of sorrow. "I was free man then, working construction for wages. We knew we was building on sacred ground, Indian burial mounds going back hundreds of years, maybe thousands. But Mr. Blackwood's father, Nathaniel, he didn't care about no sacred ground. He cared about cheap land near running water." "What happened when construction began?" "First week we was digging foundation trenches, we hit something that weren't no Indian grave," Solomon continued. "Deep down, maybe 20 feet below the oldest burials, we found a chamber made of black stone. Carved all over with symbols that hurt your eyes to look at. And in the center of that chamber was something sleeping." Thomas felt ice form in his veins. "What was it?" "Older than humanity," Sarah whispered. "We've caught glimpses of it over the years, when the basement floods or when someone falls through weak floorboards into the deep levels. It's not quite alive and not quite dead, something in between, something that feeds on human purpose and will." Marcus picked up the story. "Nathaniel Blackwood made his pact with that thing the night before the mill opened. Traded the lives of his workers for prosperity and protection. Every foreman since then has been part of the sacrifice schedule, their strong life force feeding the entity for a decade at a time. But there must be a weakness," Thomas insisted. "Every supernatural compact has conditions, limitations. What are the terms of the covenant?" The ghostly workers exchanged glances. Finally, Solomon spoke, the contract requires willing participation from a Blackwood family member. If the bloodline ever refuses to honor the pact, the entity loses its hold on this place. Then I need to convince Jeremiah to break the contract. Impossible, Sarah said sadly. The Blackwood family has grown rich and powerful through this arrangement. Jeremiah will never willingly give up what the entity provides. Thomas felt despair creeping into his heart, but then Solomon's words sparked an idea. What about unwilling participation? What if Jeremiah isn't the one making the choice? Before the ghosts could respond, a new presence entered the mill. Thomas felt it immediately, a crushing weight of ancient hunger and malevolent intelligence pressing down on the building. The ghostly workers became agitated, their forms flickering as if the entity's awakening made it harder for them to maintain coherence. It knows you're here, Marcus said urgently. It knows you've learned the truth. You have to leave, now, before it decides to collect you early. But as Thomas turned toward the exit, he found Jeremiah Blackwood standing in the doorway, no longer bothering to maintain his facade of normalcy. His pale eyes now glowed with an inner light that was definitely not human, and when he smiled, Thomas could see that his teeth had grown sharp. Going somewhere, Mr. Hartwell? Blackwood's voice carried harmonics that resonated in frequencies human ears weren't meant to detect. I'm afraid our basement inspection has been moved up to tonight. The ghostly workers pressed closer around Thomas, but they seemed unable to interact with the living world in any meaningful way. They could observe and communicate, but they couldn't interfere with the entity's plans. I know about the contract, Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady. I know about the primary sacrifice. Of course you do, Blackwood replied, stepping into the mill and closing the door behind him. I left the safe unlocked specifically so you would find it. The entity enjoys informed sacrifices, the fear and desperation add flavor to the life force. Thomas backed away as Blackwood advanced, the man's form seeming to grow larger and less human with each step. The people in town know I'm here. If I disappear, they'll assume you ran off like so many other foremen before you, Blackwood interrupted. No one will look for you, just as no one looked for the others. The mill has an excellent reputation for making troublesome employees simply vanish. The floorboards beneath Thomas's feet began to vibrate with a low, rhythmic pulsing, like a massive heartbeat coming from deep underground. The entity was fully awake now, anticipating its feeding. Why? Thomas asked, still backing away toward the far end of the mill floor. Why continue this? You're already wealthy, already powerful. Why keep feeding that thing? Blackwood laughed, the sound carrying echoes of voices that had been screaming for decades. Because wealth and power are nothing compared to what the entity offers, immortality. Every soul it claims extends my life by years. I've been alive for over a century, Mr. Hartwell, and I plan to live for centuries more. Thomas realized he'd been backed up against a section of floor marked with one of the red X's from Blackwood's map. The boards beneath his feet felt soft and unstable, as if the foundation below had been deliberately weakened. This is where you fall through, Blackwood explained conversationally. A tragic accident during a late-night inspection. Your body will never be found, of course, it will feed the entity directly in its chamber far below. But your spirit will join our night shift, working forever to sustain the thing that consumed your flesh. The floorboards creaked ominously as Thomas's weight pressed down on them. In a few more steps, he would crash through into the basement levels, and from there into whatever depths held the ancient entity. But Solomon's words echoed in his mind, the contract required willing participation from a Blackwood family member. What about your daughter? Thomas asked suddenly. Blackwood froze mid-step. What about Sarah? She's part of the bloodline. She could choose to break the contract. Sarah is 8 years old, Blackwood snarled. She knows nothing about the family business. But she will someday. And when she learns what you've done, what you've committed her to inherit, do you think she'll choose to continue it? For the first time, Thomas saw uncertainty flicker in Blackwood's glowing eyes. The man had been so focused on his own immortality that he hadn't considered what would happen when his daughter came of age and learned the truth about their family's prosperity. "She'll understand," Blackwood said, but his voice lacked conviction. "She'll see the necessity." "Will she?" Thomas pressed. "When she learns that her father murdered dozens of innocent people? When she discovers that every comfort she's ever known was paid for with blood? What 8-year-old girl grows up to embrace becoming a monster?" The floorboards beneath Thomas gave an ominous crack, but he ignored them, focusing entirely on the growing doubt in Blackwood's expression. "You've been thinking short-term," Thomas continued. 10-year cycles, one foreman at a time. But the contract is generational. What happens when Sarah refuses to honor it? What happens when the Blackwood line fails to provide the entity with its promised sacrifices? Blackwood's inhuman features began to flicker, his true form wavering as uncertainty undermined his confidence. "She'll be convinced. She'll be taught to understand. Or she'll be horrified by what her father became, and she'll do everything in her power to destroy this place and free the souls you've trapped here." The ancient presence beneath the mill seemed to sense its servant's doubt. The rhythmic pulsing grew more agitated, and Thomas could hear something vast and hungry stirring in the depths below. But he also sensed opportunity. If he could drive a wedge between Blackwood and the entity, perhaps he could survive long enough to find another solution. "The entity chose poorly when it picked your family," Thomas said. "Humans aren't reliable long-term partners. We're unpredictable, emotional, capable of changing our minds. Sooner or later, a Blackwood will refuse the compact, and then what? All these decades of feeding, all these trapped souls, all for nothing when your bloodline betrays the entity's trust." Blackwood raised his hand, and Thomas saw that his fingernails had grown into black claws. "Enough. You die tonight, and Sarah will be raised to understand her responsibilities." But even as Blackwood spoke, they both heard something that changed everything, the sound of small footsteps on the mill floor above them. A child's voice called down from the second floor, "Papa? Are you down there? I had a bad dream." Thomas and Blackwood looked up to see 8-year-old Sarah Blackwood standing at the top of the stairs in her white nightgown, rubbing her eyes sleepily. She must have followed her father to the mill, and now she was witnessing the confrontation that would determine not just Thomas's fate, but the future of her family's dark legacy. "Would you run if you discovered your employer planned to sacrifice you to an ancient evil for profit, or try to save the other workers?" The little girl's presence changed everything. Whatever happened next would shape her understanding of who her father truly was, and whether she would choose to continue the covenant when her time came to decide. "Sarah, go back to the house immediately," Blackwood commanded, his voice strained as he fought to maintain human appearance in front of his daughter. The inhuman features flickered like a badly tuned photograph, sharp teeth retracting and glowing eyes dimming to their normal pale blue. But 8-year-old Sarah Blackwood had inherited her father's keen intelligence along with his pale eyes. She descended the stairs slowly, taking in the scene before her father's agitated state, the terrified man backed against the unstable floor section, and something else, the translucent figures of workers who shouldn't have been there. "Papa, why are there people in the mill at night?" Sarah asked, her child's clarity cutting through the supernatural tension like a blade. "And why can I see through them?" Thomas realized that children, with their unformed understanding of what was possible and impossible, could perceive the ghostly workers more clearly than most adults. Sarah was seeing the night shift in all their spectral reality. "Sarah, you need to listen to me," Thomas said quickly, before Blackwood could respond. "Your father has been making deals with something very dangerous. Something that lives under the mill and feeds on people who work here." Silence. Blackwood snarled, his facade cracking further. "Sarah, don't listen to him. He's trying to hurt Papa. But Sarah had noticed the ghostly workers gathering around them, and her young face showed more curiosity than fear. "Are you dead?" she asked Solomon Washington directly. The ancient spirit looked down at her with infinite sadness. "Yes, child. We all are. Been dead for years, some of us decades. But we can't rest because of what your Papa done." "What did Papa do?" Before anyone could answer, the mill itself responded to the crisis. The entity beneath had grown impatient with Blackwood's hesitation and the complications introduced by his daughter's presence. If its servant couldn't complete the sacrifice, it would take matters into its own supernatural hands. The floorboards around Thomas suddenly gave way with a thunderous crack, but instead of falling into the basement, he found himself standing on solid planks that had rotted through moments before. The mill's machinery began starting up on its own, looms clattering to life, spinning frames whirring into motion, steam pipes hissing with pressure that shouldn't have existed. "It's angry," Sarah Coolidge's ghost called out over the rising mechanical noise. "The entity's taking direct control." The mill transformed into a battleground between the living and forces that defied natural law. Steam pipes burst, sending scalding clouds through the air. Loom shuttles fired across the floor like bullets. Drive belts snapped and thrashed like serpents, while spinning frames accelerated beyond their design limits, threatening to tear themselves apart. Thomas grabbed Sarah Blackwood's hand. "We have to get out of here." But Blackwood blocked their path to the exit, his human mask finally falling away completely. His form stretched and elongated, clothes tearing as his body took on proportions that belonged in nightmares rather than reality. His fingers extended into razor-sharp claws, and when he opened his mouth, row upon row of needle teeth gleamed in the supernatural light. "No one leaves," he hissed in a voice layered with harmonics from the depths below. "The entity demands its sacrifice, and it will have it, starting with the bloodline that has served it so faithfully." Thomas realized with horror that the ancient thing beneath had decided Blackwood's uncertainty made him unreliable. If it couldn't trust its human servant, it would simply consume the entire Blackwood family and find new agents. "Sarah, your father isn't in control anymore," Thomas shouted over the chaos of self-operating machinery. "That thing underground is using him like a puppet." The little girl looked up at her transformed father with the devastating clarity that only children possess. "You're not my papa anymore, are you?" The thing wearing Blackwood's form lunged toward them, but Solomon Washington's spirit somehow managed to interfere, his ghostly presence creating a barrier that made the creature stumble. "Run, child. Get to the basement." "The basement?" Thomas protested. "That's where the entity is." "The entity's chamber is deep below," Marcus Henley's ghost called out as he helped Solomon hold back the transformed Blackwood. "But there's something else in the basement, the original binding stone where the first covenant was made. If a Blackwood touches that stone and speaks the words of release, it could break the contract." Thomas lifted Sarah in his arms and ran toward the basement stairs, dodging pieces of machinery that flew through the air like missiles. Behind them, the ghostly workers formed a defensive line, using whatever supernatural abilities they possessed to slow down the creature that had once been Jeremiah Blackwood. The basement was a maze of support pillars and storage rooms, lit by the same sourceless illumination that filled the mill at night. Thomas could hear something vast moving in the depths below, the entity itself, rising through layers of earth and ancient stone to deal personally with the crisis. "Where's the binding stone?" Thomas asked Sarah as they navigated the basement corridors. "I don't know," she said, but then pointed toward a section of the basement where the air seemed to shimmer with heat distortion. "But it feels wrong over there. Like when you look at something scary but can't look away." They followed her intuition through storage rooms filled with cotton bales and past machinery that seemed to operate itself in the supernatural light. The wrongness Sarah had sensed grew stronger as they approached the far corner of the basement, where the mill's foundation met what appeared to be natural rock. There, set into the wall like an altar, was a slab of black stone covered with the same twisted symbols Thomas had seen on Blackwood's safe. The binding stone radiated malevolence so thick it was almost visible, and touching it would clearly be agonizing for anyone with human sensibilities. "I have to touch that?" Sarah asked, her 8-year-old voice small and frightened. "I'm afraid so," Thomas said gently. "But I'll be right here with you." Before they could approach the stone, the basement filled with the sound of splintering wood and shrieking metal from above. The transformed Blackwood had broken through the ghostly workers' defense and was coming for them. Heavy footsteps thundered down the basement stairs, accompanied by a roar that seemed to come from the earth's core. But there was another sound too, a rhythmic pounding from far below, as if something enormous was climbing up through layers of rock and soil. "Hurry," Thomas urged. "Both your father and the entity are coming." Sarah approached the binding stone with the fearless determination that only children can muster when they truly understand what's at stake. "What words do I say?" Thomas realized he didn't know. The covenant document had been written in that twisted script he could barely read, and he hadn't memorized the termination clause. But Solomon Washington's spirit materialized beside them. "I was there when the first pact was made," he said. "I heard the words. Child, you must place your hand on the stone and say, 'By the blood of Blackwood, I release all bonds. By the choice of Blackwood, I free all souls. By the will of Blackwood, I break this covenant forever.'" Sarah reached toward the stone, but hesitated as her father's monstrous form appeared at the bottom of the basement stairs. The thing that had been Jeremiah Blackwood was no longer even roughly human. It had become a writhing mass of shadow and hunger, held together by the entity's will. "Sarah," it called in a voice like grinding stone. "Don't touch that stone. It will destroy everything we've built, everything we are." For a moment, Sarah wavered. This creature might be transformed beyond recognition, but it had once been her father. It had read her bedtime stories, taught her to ride horses, held her when she cried. But then she looked at Thomas, and at the ghostly workers who had gathered around them in the basement, and she saw the truth that adults often struggle to accept: sometimes the people we love become monsters, and love means stopping them rather than enabling them. Sarah Blackwood placed her small hand on the binding stone. The moment her skin made contact with the black rock, several things happened simultaneously. Pain shot through her like lightning, and she screamed with the agony of touching something that was fundamentally opposed to human life. The transformed Blackwood charged toward them with inhuman speed. And from the depths below came an answering roar of rage as the entity realized its centuries-old compact was about to be severed. But 8-year-old Sarah Blackwood, with the iron will that ran in her family's bloodline, spoke the words of release through her pain: "By the blood of Blackwood, I release all bonds. By the choice of Blackwood, I free all souls. By the will of Blackwood, I break this covenant forever." The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The binding stone cracked down the middle with a sound like thunder. The basement walls began to crumble as the supernatural forces that had held the mill together for decades suddenly vanished. And the transformed Blackwood collapsed mid-charge, its borrowed power cut off at the source. But the entity below was not finished. If it couldn't have its servants, it would drag the entire mill down into its chamber and feast on whatever souls it could claim in the chaos. The basement floor began to split open, revealing glimpses of caverns that stretched down into primordial darkness. Thomas grabbed Sarah and ran for the stairs as cracks spread through the foundation like a spider web of destruction. Behind them, something vast and ancient rose from the depths, not quite seen but definitely felt, a presence of such malevolent hunger that it made the air itself taste of despair. The mill was collapsing, but they still had to escape before the entire structure came down on top of them. And somewhere in the chaos above, the freed spirits of 22 years' worth of victims were finally able to rest, if Thomas and Sarah could survive long enough to see them go. Thomas carried Sarah up the basement stairs as the mill disintegrated around them. The binding stone's destruction had severed the supernatural forces holding the building together, and 2 decades of deferred structural failure were happening all at once. Support beams cracked with sounds like gunshots, walls buckled outward, and sections of the floor dropped into the growing chasm that had opened in the basement. They reached the main floor to find it transformed into a battlefield between natural law and dying magic. Machinery that had been running without power now seized and shattered as physical reality reasserted itself. The ghostly workers flickered in and out of visibility, their forms growing more translucent as the entity's hold on them weakened. "Is it over?" Sarah asked, her small hand still burning from contact with the binding stone. "Not yet," Thomas replied, noting that the building's collapse was accelerating. "We still have to get out alive." The transformed Jeremiah Blackwood lay crumpled near the basement entrance, his borrowed monstrosity fading as the entity's power withdrew. But he was still breathing, still alive beneath the supernatural shell that was peeling away like shed skin. Sarah pulled free from Thomas's arms and ran to her father's side. "Papa?" Jeremiah's eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in years, they were completely human, pale blue and filled with horrified awareness of what he had become. "Sarah," he whispered. "What have I done? What did I let that thing make me do?" "You made bad choices, Papa," Sarah said with the devastating honesty of childhood. "But I fixed them." The mill gave a tremendous groan as another section of foundation collapsed into the entity's chamber. Through the gaps in the floor, Thomas could see movement in the depths, something massive and ancient thrashing in frustrated rage as its centuries of careful planning crumbled along with its prison. "We have to go," Thomas urged. "The whole building is coming down." Jeremiah struggled to his feet, supported by his daughter. The supernatural strength that had sustained him was gone, leaving behind a man who looked every one of his century-plus years. "I can't. I'm too weak." "The entity kept you alive artificially." Sarah Coolidge's ghost appeared beside them, her form now so translucent Thomas could barely see her. "Without its power, your body remembers its true age." But even as she spoke, the ghostly worker was fading. Around the mill floor, the other spirits were becoming harder to see as the bonds that tied them to this place finally loosened. "Are you leaving?" Sarah asked the ghosts. "We're free," Marcus Henley's spirit replied, his voice growing distant. "For the first time in decades, we can rest. Thank you, brave girl. You gave us the peace we've been seeking." Solomon Washington was the last to fade, his ancient presence lingering as the others departed. "The entity ain't destroyed," he warned. "Just cut off from the surface. Someday, someone else might dig deep enough to find it again. But for now, it's trapped in the old chambers where it belongs." As the last of the spirits vanished, the mill's supernatural illumination died, leaving them in complete darkness. But through the windows, Thomas could see the first pale light of dawn breaking over the Tennessee hills. They made their way toward the main entrance, supporting Jeremiah between them as debris rained down from the collapsing ceiling. The mill that had stood for 22 years was dying in minutes, all its supernatural structural integrity gone. They burst through the main doors just as the roof caved in behind them. The three of them stumbled across the mill yard as the entire building folded in on itself with a roar like an avalanche. Dust clouds billowed outward, and when they finally settled, Blackwood Cotton Mill was gone, reduced to a pile of rubble that filled the crater left by the entity's chamber. Thomas, Sarah, and Jeremiah sat on the grass beyond the mill gates, watching the sun rise over the destruction. Jeremiah aged visibly as they watched, his hair turning white and his face gaining decades of lines in minutes. "How long do I have?" he asked Thomas. "I don't know," Thomas replied honestly. "But probably not long." Jeremiah nodded, accepting this with surprising peace. "Good. I've lived too long already, done too many terrible things." He looked at his daughter with eyes full of love and regret. "Sarah, I need you to know that everything I did was wrong. The mill, the workers who died, the deal with that thing underground, all of it was evil, and I'm sorry." "I know, Papa," Sarah said simply. "That's why I had to stop it." "What will happen to her?" Jeremiah asked Thomas. "She has no other family." Thomas had been thinking about this as they escaped the mill. "I'll take care of her," he said. "I'll make sure she has a good life, away from all this." Jeremiah smiled, and for a moment he looked like the man he might have been if he'd never made his dark bargain. "Thank you." He turned back to Sarah. "Be better than your papa was. Choose kindness over power, always." "I will," Sarah promised. Jeremiah Blackwood died as the sun fully cleared the horizon, his artificially extended life finally coming to its natural end. Sarah cried quietly as Thomas held her, mourning the father she'd lost long before this night, when he'd first chosen to feed human souls to an ancient evil. They buried Jeremiah in the town cemetery, the new one, far from the mill site, and Thomas legally adopted Sarah as his ward. He used his foreman's wages and the considerable sum he found in Blackwood's personal accounts to buy a small farm outside Millbrook, where they could live quietly and heal from the trauma they'd survived. The mill site was declared unstable by county authorities after a geological survey revealed extensive underground caverns. The land was purchased by the state and left undeveloped, though Thomas made sure a proper memorial was erected for all the workers who had died there. Sarah grew up knowing the truth about her family's dark legacy, but she chose to honor it by dedicating her life to helping others. She became a teacher, then a school principal, and eventually established orphanages for children who had lost their parents to industrial accidents. Thomas often wondered if she remembered the night she'd broken the covenant, or if her 8-year-old mind had processed it as a particularly vivid nightmare. But sometimes, when they visited the memorial together, he would catch her listening to the wind with an expression of satisfaction, as if she could hear the peaceful rest of souls finally free from their eternal labor. The entity beneath the mill was never seen again, though Thomas occasionally heard rumors of strange geological activity in other parts of Tennessee where old burial grounds had been disturbed. He hoped that Sarah's courage had not just freed the trapped spirits, but had also served as a warning to others who might be tempted to make similar bargains with things that should remain buried. As for the mill site itself, wildflowers began growing there within months of the building's destruction. Local botanists were puzzled by the varieties that appeared. Some seemed to be species that had been extinct in Tennessee for decades, as if the land was remembering what it had been before human greed corrupted it. 6 months after the mill's destruction, Thomas returned to Millbrook with Sarah to attend the memorial dedication. The town had changed in the intervening time, people walked with lighter steps, children played more freely, and the sense of oppressive watchfulness that had hung over the community for decades had lifted like fog in morning sun. The memorial itself was simple but dignified, a granite monument listing the names of all 37 workers who had died at Blackwood Cotton Mill, surrounded by a garden where Sarah had planted flowers from seeds they'd gathered on their farm. The inscription read, "In memory of those who labored here, may they rest in peace eternal." A surprising number of townspeople attended the dedication ceremony. Thomas recognized many faces from that first morning at the train station, the same people who had tried to warn him away from the mill. They approached him and Sarah with expressions of gratitude and wonder. "We felt it the morning the mill came down," the elderly woman with the black bonnet told Thomas. "Like a weight lifted off the whole valley. Birds started singing again in places where they'd been silent for 20 years. The ceremony was brief and respectful. The local minister spoke about the dignity of honest labor and the importance of remembering those who had paid the ultimate price for other people's prosperity. Sarah, now 9 years old, laid the first wreath on the memorial. As the crowd dispersed, Thomas and Sarah remained beside the monument. The mill site beyond it had been transformed into something beautiful and strange. Wildflowers grew in patterns that seemed almost intentional, creating natural spirals and mandalas across the ground where the building had once stood. Local naturalists claimed they'd never seen such rapid and organized plant growth, but Thomas suspected the freed spirits of the mill workers had something to do with the land's remarkable recovery. "Do you miss him?" Thomas asked Sarah as they sat on a bench overlooking the flower garden. She considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "I miss the papa I thought I had," she said finally. "But I don't miss the papa he really was." "Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Thomas assured her. A gentle breeze stirred the wildflowers, and Thomas could have sworn he heard something in the wind, not voices exactly, but a sound like distant singing, peaceful and content. Sarah heard it too, judging by the small smile that crossed her face. "They're happy now," she said with certainty. As they prepared to leave, a young woman approached them hesitantly. Thomas recognized her as Jenny Morrison, daughter of one of the mill workers whose name was carved on the memorial. "Miss Sarah?" Jenny said quietly. "I wanted to thank you. My daddy died in that mill when I was little, and Mama always said he couldn't rest easy. But the night the mill came down, she had a dream about him. He looked peaceful for the first time in years, and he told her he was finally going home." Sarah took the young woman's hand. "I'm glad he found peace." Jenny nodded, tears in her eyes. "Mama wanted you to have this." She handed Sarah a small wooden carving, a bird in flight, its wings spread wide. "Daddy made it before he died. Mama says she wants it to go to someone who understands about setting things free." Sarah accepted the carving with the solemnity it deserved. "I'll treasure it." As they walked back toward town, Thomas marveled at how the community had begun to heal. New businesses were opening, families were moving back to the area, and there was talk of establishing a proper school to replace the cramped one-room building that had served the town for decades. "Will we come back here again?" Sarah asked as they boarded the afternoon train. "If you want to," Thomas replied. "This will always be part of your story, but it doesn't have to define your future." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "I want to come back sometimes. To make sure the flowers keep growing and to remember the people who couldn't leave on their own." The train pulled away from Millbrook station, carrying them back to their quiet farm and peaceful life. But Thomas knew that Sarah would indeed return to this place throughout her life, drawn by a sense of responsibility for the souls she had freed and the land she had helped heal. Years later, when Sarah had grown into a remarkable woman dedicated to helping others, she would establish a foundation that provided assistance to families affected by industrial accidents. The foundation's symbol was a bird in flight, inspired by her father's carving and representing the freedom she had given to 37 trapped souls. The mill site remained undeveloped, gradually returning to the wild state it had known before human ambition disturbed its ancient peace. But it was not empty. Visitors often reported a sense of contentment in the flower-covered grounds, as if the land itself remembered being healed. Local folklore claimed that on quiet nights, you could sometimes hear the sound of happy voices carried on the wind, not the desperate whispers of trapped spirits, but the joyful conversation of people who had finally found their way home. Thomas lived to see Sarah become a pillar of her community, marry a good man who shared her dedication to helping others, and raise children who inherited her sense of justice and compassion. On his deathbed, surrounded by the family she had built, he told her he was proud of the choice she had made that night in the mill basement. "You could have been afraid," he said with his last breath. "You could have chosen to preserve your family's power rather than risk everything for people you'd never met. But you chose to do what was right, even when it cost you everything." Sarah held his hand as he passed peacefully, and later that evening, she thought she heard his voice join the contented chorus that sometimes sang in the wind above the place where Blackwood Cotton Mill had once stood. The entity that had slept beneath the mill remained in its deep chambers, cut off from the surface world and the human energy it had fed upon for so many years. Sometimes construction crews in other parts of Tennessee reported finding old burial chambers or unusual stone formations, but they were always quickly sealed and left undisturbed. The lessons of Blackwood Mill had spread quietly through the region, carried by survivors who understood the danger of disturbing things that were meant to stay buried. And in the gardens that grew where the mill had once exploited human suffering, the wildflowers bloomed year after year in patterns that seemed to spell out a message for those who knew how to read them. Some ground is sacred, some prices are too high to pay, and some debts can only be settled by those brave enough to choose what's right over what's profitable. If this story stayed with you, if you understand that some ground is sacred and some price is too high to pay, comment, "The dead deserve their rest." The flowers still grow there, they say, in the place where a little girl's courage freed 37 souls and broke a covenant that should never have been made. And on quiet mornings when the Tennessee wind blows just right, you can hear them singing their gratitude to the child who gave them the greatest gift of all, the right to finally rest in peace.